Hello and welcome to MyBook, a podcast about books and their authors with a South Asian touch. My name is Saif Mahmood. In this episode, I will be in conversation with Dr. Maaz Bin Bilal as we continue our journey discussing some of the most interesting books published recently. We will talk to Maaz about his recently published English translation of the great poet Mirza Ghalib's long poem on Benares, Chiragh-e-Dair. The translation is titled Temple Lamp.
Mir says, उसके फरोग़े हुस्न से झमके है सब में नूर, शामे हरम हो याहुद या सोमनाथ का. And Ghalib says, in my translation I'll read from the Persian, in this poem, the supreme place of worship for the conch blowers. Surely Benares is the Kaaba of Hindustan. I think these are two very important verses from Mir and Ghalib, and Ghalib's verse possibly owes something to Mir's, in that both of them find respectively lamp of Somnath, and I should perhaps read the English translation of this one as well. Light sparkles everywhere from the aura of his beauty, be it in eve of the Kaaba or the lamp of Somnath. Mir finds the lamp of Somnath and Ghalib finds Benares. Comparable to Kaaba in the sense that they feel that it's the same almighty, the same divine power that lends its glory to all religions, all faiths, definitely Islam and Hinduism, both.
Maaz Bin Bilal is a poet, translator, and academic whose works have received critical acclaim. He teaches literary studies at the O.P. Jindal University in India. Dr. Maaz Bin Bilal, let me extend a very warm welcome to you on our show, My Book. Maaz is currently in Stuttgart in Germany as a fellow, and I am in New Delhi. And the producer, Parvez Alam, the producer of this show, he is in London. So this is literally an international podcast show. Welcome, Maaz.
Thank you, Saif Saab.
Maaz, let me begin by asking you this. Your translation, Temple Lamp, is the first ever complete translation of Ghalib's Persian ode to Benares. Why did you decide to translate this particular poem of Ghalib, and what is it in Chiragh-e-Dair that endears you to it?
Chiragh-e-Dair is Mirza Ghalib's ode to Benares, the holiest of Hindu cities, in Persian, in Farsi. It has indeed been translated before in other languages. In Urdu, there are multiple translations available. There are at least a couple of translations available in Hindi as well, Professor Sadiq's translation being a more recent Hindi translation. There have been other partial translations done in English before my work, and there have been two other English translations, but those two have been done via other translations, which are called bridge translations, therefore. So a translation has been done via Hindi and another translation via the Urdu of Kalidas Gupta Raza and via the Hindi of Professor Sadiq. I chose to translate this work partly at the behest of Professor Sadiq, but also because I got deeply interested in Chiragh-e-Dair for a number of different reasons. I've always been a fan, a student of Mirza Ghalib's Urdu ghazals, his Urdu poetry, his Urdu prose, and I arrived at Chiragh-e-Dair because it was a work by Ghalib. Chiragh-e-Dair particularly appealed to me because of the great investment that this poet, from the greatest of Urdu poets from 19th century, coming from a Muslim background, and at a time when Benares is the center of a new kind of India, perhaps, that is being shaped, I thought it pertinent to look at this 19th century poet's version of his Benares. And also, of course, as a poem, I thought it is incredibly delightful, incredibly charming, and I wanted Indian and global audiences to be able to savor it to the fullest extent possible, particularly at a time when Persian is no longer thriving language in India, let's say. It's largely a language of academics. So I thought an English translation at this time could be enjoyed by a large number of people.
For me, Maaz, I think more powerful than your translations is your scholarly and long introduction to the book, to the translations. Not only does it do justice to the poem and the poet, but also to the reader. It speaks to the reader. So let me take you to your introduction, where you say that this poem views Benares through a Persian cultural inheritance lens and from the perspective of a Hindustani Muslim So can you please explain what you mean by a Hindustani Muslim in this context?
I think if we look at the main poet at hand, Mirza Ghalib, but also the great from the previous century, I should say, Mir Taqi Mir, and we look at their poetry, I think some of their verses give us a great insight into what a Hindustani Muslim is, perhaps even today. I'll read Mir Taqi Mir Sher from the original Urdu and give its translation to explain my point further. Mir says, उसके फरोग हुस्न से झमके है सब में नूर शामे हरम हो या हो दिया सोमनाथ का. And Ghalib says, in my translation, I'll read from the Persian, in this poem, the supreme place of worship for the conch blowers. Surely Benares is the Kaaba of Hindustan. I think these are two very important verses from Mir and Ghalib, and Ghalib's verse possibly owes something to Mir's, in that both of them find respectively lamp of Somnath, and I should perhaps read the English translation of this one as well. Light sparkles everywhere from the aura of his beauty, be it in eve of the Kaaba or the lamp of Somnath. Mir finds the lamp of Somnath and Ghalib finds Benares, comparable to Kaaba in the sense that they feel that it's the same almighty, the same divine power that lends its glory to all religions, all faiths, definitely Islam and Hinduism, both. And I think this kind of knowledge, this kind of belief system is largely possible only to South Asian Muslims in a way that it isn't possible to other Muslims, perhaps to Southeast Asian Muslims as well, Indonesians perhaps, or Malaysians, but not to many Arab Muslims, for example, or not to even other Muslims of the world, in the same way that South Asian Muslims have quite a unique perspective on life and religion because of this. I'd read another qata in the original Farsi by Ghalib and then read my translation of it to explain this point further. Ghalib says, Masan shauqate urfi ke bood shirazi, mashu asir zulali ke bood khansari, basomnate khayalam dar aaye tabini, ravan faroz bardush hai zunnari. Do not be awed by Urfi even if he is from Shiraz. Don't be taken by Zulali, though he comes from Khansar. Come into the Somnath of my imagination and see soul-stirring forms adorned with the Janeu on my shoulders. So this is a Muslim poet who is proud of almost wearing a Janeu on his shoulders. He comes from a Turco-Hindustani Muslim elite himself, and he identifies with elites of the other different communities, the Christians, the Hindus. Ghalib's patrons were from many different communities. And he proudly views the world from these multiple perspectives. His view is just not just Islamic, it is not just Hindu, it is not just Buddhist. Gopi Chand Narang has argued for Buddhist influences on Ghalib as well. He's aware of the Abrahamic tradition through Islam, but also through direct contact with the Christians, the British soldiers and officers around the time. And this is his worldview. This is how he views the world around him. And he takes what is inspirational, what is best for him from all these different religions. And I think that is why it is this view, this minority position is interesting to view a majority culture, I think, for that reason as well.
Yes, surely. And very interestingly, when he draws this parallel between the Kaaba, which is the holiest place or the holiest site for Muslims in the world, the parallel is with a city that is the complete antithesis of the idol-less Kaaba, the house of the formless God. Don't you find it interesting that he does not call it the Kaaba of Hindus, but the Kaaba of India? Kaaba-i-Hinud is not what he says. He says Kaaba-i-Hindustan.
Khushwant Singh was the first, the great editor and writer. Khushwant Singh was the first to remark upon this fact that Ghalib does not call Benares Kaaba-i-Hinud. And he sees Benares as the Kaaba of Hindustan, the Kaaba of everyone here. So he is doing something interesting here. He sees that all people who belong to India perhaps see it as an important site of devotion, of spirituality, and it is inspirational to many. And Benares has to its credit not just the long Shaivite tradition, but Kabir lived in Benares and used to come to Ganga Ghat to give his sermons, read out his dohas there. And he intentionally chose to die out of Benares to challenge the orthodoxy there as well. Gautam Buddha came to Benares, although he gave his main sermons just outside Benares at Sarnath as well. I suppose both Kabir and the Buddha were trying to also speak out against the orthodoxy that was getting enshrined in Benares. But yet they had to come to Benares to speak about their worldviews, to speak about their prophetic views on religion, on spirituality, on mankind. Of course, Benares also has a long tradition of Islamic saints coming there as well. There are over 1,000 mosques and shrines in the city that somehow don't get taken into cognition the same way as the other religious sites of importance there. It is, in a scholarly sense as well, in a deep theological sense, the center of at least definitely North Indian spirituality, but even all Indian spirituality. People have been traveling to Benares from the deep south of India and from the east and the west for millennia. I suppose it is for Ghalib, importantly, the Kaaba of Hindustan. It's commendable that you point it out, as did the great Khushwant Singh.
Let me just shift gear now, Maaz, and come to another issue. Ghalib was very proud of his Urdu verse. He had this deep-seated pride in his Urdu verse. He says, "Jo ye kahe कि रेख्ता क्यों कर हो रश्क फारसी गुफ्ताए गालिब एक बार पढ़कर उसे सुना कि यूं." Those who say how rekhta or Urdu can be the envy of Persian read them out Ghalib's verse and say, this is how. But despite this pride in his Urdu verse, he chose to write this Masnavi in Persian. Why do you think that happened?
So while Ghalib is, of course, greatly proud of his Urdu poetry and he lives on primarily as an Urdu poet, it is not very widely known that he did write almost double the amount in Persian. Why he did so, there can be different conjectures, scholarly conjectures about this. He gives us some clues as well, to which I'll get in a moment. But he probably was doing so because I think Urdu came to him more naturally as an Indian language. And he wrote in Urdu as a younger poet. He had written most of his Urdu poetry by the time of his early 20s. But then he was born into a family in which Persian was also an important language. And Persian also came naturally to him. And therefore, his Urdu poetry is greatly Persianized, more Persianized than the poets around him at the Mughal court of Bahadur Shah Zafar, more Persianized than the important poet Mir Taqi Mir of the previous century, to whom I've already referred. And I think so that partly led him towards Persian, but also I think he's a complex man who had great ambitions. And he wanted to have perhaps what to him would be a global audience. The globe of his time, and although the world was changing, there was a shift, ongoing shift away from the Mughal to the British Raj in India. But the world that he had been a part of, and the Mughal court was still a vassal court but still existed for most of his life, it was part of the larger Persian cosmopolis, which different scholars have argued existed from all the way from Turkey to Bengal. And that was largely the world that was important to Ghalib. And he would have wanted to be read in this whole world. Persian was also the court language. It was even the court language for the British for the longest time. Therefore, it was important to write in the higher register. He wrote other volumes in Persian. Even after 1857, he wrote a diary, a Stambui, that he sent to, that he had gold gilded and bound and sent to even the monarch in Britain. And that was also in Persian. And this poem, I think even more specifically, he would have preferred to write in Persian for a bunch of reasons, apart from the ones that I've already listed. And those would be the fact that when he's comparing Benares and almost deifying it and comparing it to Kaaba, and not just to the Kaaba, but to Kasha in Iran and to China, and saying that it's as good and even better than these places, I think he's trying to have this cosmopolitan dialogue with these other centers, particularly with regard to Benares, to try to valorize it internationally. So if he had done it in Urdu, this value to Benares would have accrued, yes, for the people of the subcontinent. And I think when he's making these international comparisons and valorizing Benares in this way, I think it's an important reason for him, an important motivation for him to do so in Persian that could be read globally. And I'll add a kind of retrospective view as well. I'm not sure how alert Ghalib would have, I mean, he was a very intelligent man, so of course he may have been alert to it as well. I think what by talking about Benares, which is this seat of Hindu culture, but also other religions, but by doing this in Persian, what is also happening at one level is an interesting act of almost cultural conversion. This translation of concepts that is happening between languages. He's translating ideas that come from the Hindu or Dharmic ideas, Buddhist ideas that come from the Sanskrit tradition, and then writing about them in Persian. And Persian is, perhaps because of its pre-Islamic Parsi kind of ancestry, is perhaps the only language apart from Indian languages. I mean, of course, Persian was an Indian language for 1,000 years, but it is born outside India. But it is this language born outside India that the one language that has words for things such as the tilak and the janeu, the kashka and the zunnar. And using words like that in that conceptual framework, and using them imagistically to ascribe these dharmic values to nature itself at times. The sky wearing a tilak, for example, is there in a poem. And in the Persian katha I read out, where he says, the janeu adorns my shoulders, and come into the Somnath of my imagination, and even that katha is in Farsi. He's doing something very interesting in a cross-cultural manner. There's a kind of fusion happening, which Urdu, being an Indian language, would have also done so, because Urdu is also heavily influenced by Persian. But to do so in Persian itself, I think, brings about this wonderful hybridity in a manner that wouldn't have been quite so in Urdu.
Thank you. Before we take a break, let me just ask you one more question about the universality of Ghalib. Do you think, and Ghalib has been compared with international poets, global poets like Spencer and Goethe. Do you think this particular poem of Ghalib that you have translated really was, for the lack of better expression, breaking point in the journey of Ghalib as a world poet?
So this is a slightly difficult question to respond to, in the sense that the category of world poetry or world literature at this point is largely shaped by Western academia. It's a kind of a post-colonial response that I'm giving, where I'd like to argue that it's largely writers who've been translated widely in Western languages who are recognized as world poets. Ghalib's Persian works particularly have not been translated into English, and this work of mine is an effort in that direction. So he has not been read as widely in the West, and not been therefore called global poet or a world poet often enough by the West. Although, as I quote in my introduction, there are the poets who have become familiar with him, the important American poets such as Adrienne Rich, for example. She has written about Ghalib and his grief coming from so far as Delhi all the way to America, and she wrote an entire collection called Homage to Ghalib. So when those in the West who are becoming familiar with his work realize his importance, I would say that indeed Ghalib is comparable to Goethe from the 18th century, or his own contemporary, the great American poet Walt Whitman, who's recognized as the poet of America from the 19th century. I think Ghalib is at par with any and all of those poets. He's perhaps at his best, he's even better than most of them. Does this poem in particular set him apart? In a lot of ways, things that he's doing are remarkable, as I've listed out, in terms of the cosmopolitanism, the almost act of religious conversion that is undergoing, a linguistic conversion that he is undertaking here in this poem. All of them are remarkable. But in terms of how modernity is often ascertained, the skepticism, the agnosticism, the questioning temperament that modernity is supposed to signify, this poem is slightly more classical as compared to that. So I think it is more in his Urdu ghazals, perhaps, that I think really his modernity shines through. Both the forms are classical. This Masnavi is classical, the ghazal is classical. But what he does within the forms, I think there are greater leaps of imagination. There are more pertinent modern questions that he comes up with in a way in the Urdu ghazals. So in that way, I mean, I've given a kind of a diffuse response. I could have said markedly that yes, Temple Lamp is the poem which sets him apart, but I do think his Urdu ghazals, I think, make him stand out even more remarkably as a modern poet. But there are very different, very interesting things happening in Temple Lamp as well.
Diffused and honest response. You are listening to MyBook, a podcast about books and their authors with Saif Mahmood. MyBook podcast show is produced by the London-based digital media house Cine Ink. I welcome you back to my conversation with Maaz Bin Bilal, whose book Temple Lamp, published by Penguin Classics, we are discussing. Temple Lamp is an English translation of Mirza Ghalib's long poem on Benares, Chiragh-e-Dair. Maaz's first book, his first collection, Ghazalnama, Poems from Delhi, Belfast and Urdu, published in 2019, was shortlisted for the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar. And his translation of Fikr Taunsvi's Partition diary, The Sixth River, also published in 2019, was also critically noted. Maaz has been the recipient of the Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship in Writing and Translation in Wales and is currently at Stuttgart in another fellowship. Welcome back, Maaz.
Thank you, Saif Saab.
Maaz, let me take you to the Masnavi itself, to the poetics and the form of the Masnavi. It's very interesting that you have pointed out in your introduction that the number of verses that comprise the text of this Masnavi, that's 108, indicates Ghalib's awareness of the dharmic traditions, in which the figure 108 is regarded as auspicious. What do you have to say about that?
So indeed, Ghalib, we know that he wrote more verses on Benares and in this meter of the Masnavi of Chiragh-e-Dair that he sent to other poet friends or other friends in letters. And some of these are beautiful. For example, I'll read one that is not included in the Masnavi itself, but that I've included in my introduction. Frangistan-e husn be hijabast, zakhakash zarra zarra aftabast. The city is the foreign country of unveiled beauty. Every speck of dust here is like the sun. There were 11 verses that he sent, including this one, to his friend Muhammad Ali Khan, and most of them don't make it to Chiragh-e-Dair. So we know that Ghalib had a larger corpus of verses, and he kept the number of the final verses in Chiragh-e-Dair intentionally at 108. So this conscious choice to keep it at 108 could not have been a fluke, I think. It is, in fact, quite consistent with a whole lot of different numerological traditions in dharmic traditions. And Ghalib would have definitely been aware of the fact that the Rudraksh has 108 beads, and the Rudraksh is ever present in Benares, which is the city of Shiva. Also called, the Benares is also called Avimukta because Shiva is never supposed to leave Benares, Kashi, and therefore Kashi is never mukt of Shiva, which is why it's called Avimukta. So in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Krishna also had 108 gopis at Vrindavan, and in the southern tradition there are 108 Divya Deshams, the temples of Vishnu revered by the 12 Alvars. In Jainism and Buddhism too, there are different numerological significances for 108. So Ghalib was, I think, a very intelligent and insightful man, and this reflects in most of his poetry, and this shows, therefore, in Chiragh-e-Dair as well.
That's very interesting, and the number of reasons that you have given in your book. And even if he was aware of some of them, I think his canvas of understanding was rather wide. Maaz, in every age one finds that works of even great writers or poets of that age are stamped with influences of past masters. In Ghalib, we see, he admits that Bedil had a seminal influence on him. Do you think in this particular poem, in Chiragh-e-Dair, you find any influence of an earlier poet on Ghalib's writing?
So, like I said, and I made the small comparisons with Mir as well, I think there are certain influences of Mir. But there are other more direct influences that other reputed better scholars than I actually have pointed out that I have also listed in my introduction. I must admit the width of my reading and the canvas of my reading is not as vast as that of Ghalib or former the recently deceased, deep loss to our Urdu literary cultures, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi Sahab as well. The scholar Tehseen Firaqi pointed out that Munir Lahori's Dar Sifate Bangala and Ghanim Kunjahi's Nairang Ishq are, and as well as Ture Marfat by Bedil himself. These are possibly strong influences on this poem. And Shamsur Rahman Farooqi adds to that list Mullah Sabiq Banarsi's Masnavi Tasir-e-Ishq, which could have been a source for Chiragh-e-Dair. But of course, there are influences of Mir as well, like I said, in different couplets and so on, that are quite evident.
Let me take you to another aspect, to the process of translation and the challenges that you faced in translation. Tell us something about your process, and also what was the most major challenge that you faced as a translator while translating the Masnavi?
I've written a note on the translation in my book where I begin with Walter Benjamin, the great literary and cultural left-leaning Marxist theorist, who has an important essay on translation where he says that a work of translation has a form of its own. And yet that form owes something to the original, but one is trying to recreate that form, but of course the exact form in one language perhaps can't be created in its absolute fidelity in another language. Otherwise, perhaps the languages would have been the same to begin with. I have translated Ghalib's Urdu ghazals prior to this, and some Urdu ghazals by Bahadur Shah Zafar and other poets, where I have tried to retain almost all prosodic elements of the original Urdu ghazal, which include a meter, which include writing in couplets, each couplet being almost a standalone poem, the sher or bait as it's called in Farsi, with a rhyme or a refrain or both, especially in the first couplet and every subsequent second line of the poem. The Masnavi in its structure is similar in that it's written in a fixed meter, it's also written in couplets, but each couplet has its own end rhyme. And in Ghalib's case, he's also kept a refrain before the end rhyme. So this is the form of the Masnavi, and like I said, I've tried to translate ghazals while retaining all the prosodic elements. But the ghazal is a poem of usually between 5 to 14 couplets, can extend to 20 or so sometimes, rarely. But the Masnavi, and it can be as long as the writer wants it to be, and in this case it is 108 verses. Persian, moreover, is more greatly compounded language than is Urdu. The izafat, the extensions of within a single word can be multiple. So you can have a compound word which is made of 5 different elements sometimes, or even more or less. So there is a lot of content, there's a lot of meaning that can be compressed into a single line of verse. And Ghalib does that. Ghalib does that most well. So to translate the Masnavi, which is, or Ghalib's Masnavi, Chiragh-e-Dair, which is 108 couplets, internal end rhymes for each couplet, didn't seem quite possible to me, or it would have read awkwardly in English. English poetry in our own time also has largely moved away from rhyme. There can be internal rhymes, there can be slant rhymes, but end rhymes do not seem to ring most well anymore. Although I do write poetry in English in the ghazal form, but the ghazal is slightly more interesting in other ways, that it's doing something quite uniquely different. It's intended as a project like that. But to make Ghalib read in that fashion today, I thought would have taken away from the vital force of this poem. The imagery that he's drawing upon, what he's doing conceptually, I think would have been affected. And yet, like I said, when I began with Walter Benjamin, I wanted to create a form that is to an extent faithful to the original as well. So what I prioritized then was this aspect of the Masnavi being comprised of baits or couplets, where the first misra, the first line of the verse, is a kind of exposition or a question, and the second is its resolution or response. And I try to be faithful to this two-part structure of each bait. And therefore, on each page of the translation, I have just translated a single bait, and I've translated that with a two-part structure as well, where I've recreated the original couplet into 2 couplets, where the first couplet gives the exposition, because as I said, the original verse line in Persian is greatly compounded, and therefore could perhaps only be satisfactorily expressed in 2 lines instead of 1. My second couplet is a response to the first couplet. So the original couplet I've recreated into a set of 2 couplets each time.
Maybe you could give us an example, of
Sure.
this kind of translation
Sure.
for our listeners to have a flavor of your translation and what you're saying.
Sure. I'm reading the second verse from the collection, from the Masnavi, Chiragh-e-Dair. Rage sangam sharare mi navisam, kafe khakam gubare mi navisam. I'm the vein of stone, my writing sparks. I'm a fistful of dirt, I write dust storms of the heart. Let me talk a little bit about the original first, using my translation. The first line speaks of the Rage Sangam, the vein of stone. You see, perhaps, I think he's especially thinking of, say, the marble here, a white marble which has these sometimes veins running through it in black or other colors. And he's writing sparks almost using that stone or in that stone, as if a stone is being ground next to each other and is creating sparks. But he's writing those sparks, he's saying. And he says, I'm a fistful of dirt, I write dust storm. Of the heart that I've included in my translation is not there literally in the original. And this is another tact that I've employed. So I'm sort of adding a layer to in my response to your question, where there are places where something that is implied in the original I have included in my translations, but kept it and explicitly, but kept it inside brackets to indicate that this part is what was implied in the original, is my interpretation of it, and it's not there literally. But I include it because what would have been perhaps more evident to a native speaker of Persian, or even to those familiar with the Persian tradition through Urdu, wouldn't be available as easily, as it wouldn't be as accessible for other English readers. So I have made that explicit in my translation, but kept that bit in brackets. So of the heart is in brackets here. But I'm the vein of the stone, my writing sparks. This is the first statement. And the second statement, I'm a fistful of dirt, I write dust storm, is like a response to that. It's like a parallel imaging across the second line, where in fact in the original even the mi navisam becomes the refrain, and sharare gubare, the are, becomes the rhyme. So even that is there. Here I've not maintained a strict rhyme, of course. Like I said, I thought it would have rung a bit hollow. So this was the way in which I thought through the work in terms of its prosody. I will perhaps make a few more remarks about the translation with regard to conceptual terms and words and other challenges. So sometimes, for example, I've retained words from the original which have become accessible in themselves. So verse 7, for example, Daratish aznawai saz khesham, kabab sholai awaz khesham. I burn in the lament of my own lute, a kebab on the flame of my own song. He uses kebab in the original. Kebab is famous the world over now. You get Turkish kebabs all over Europe and everywhere. I think most people know kebab. Although I might add a funny anecdote here. I'd done the same exercise in a Zafar translation once, where he had also said, my heart has become like a kebab, and I had retained kebab. And a person wrote to me on social media complimenting and praising the translation very highly, but they said they had objection to this word kebab. I said, really? Tell me why. They said it doesn't rhyme to, and I just asked them, are you vegetarian? And they said they were, and perhaps that was the reason of their objection. But yes, so in places I have retained original words which have become accepted or have been translated like that. Tamasha I've included elsewhere as well. Tamasha is now a word that is accepted by the Oxford English Dictionary. Again, to give another anecdote, in another previous Ghalib translation only, I'd used the word tamasha, and a colleague, another academic, has written half an essay, which I thought was interesting, about my translation, where he's condemned this, that I've used tamasha, which is an Urdu word, in my English translation, and retained it. I should have translated it, but perhaps they did not know that tamasha is now included in the Oxford English Dictionary. And although that is not to say that one cannot retain original words otherwise also, which one does and one should, when especially they hint at conceptual terms that aren't easily translatable. So similarly, I have retained, or in fact changed, Ghalib's use of zunnar to janeu, because janeu as a term within at least definitely the South Asian context is most easily accessible and understandable across our multilingual cultures. Most people across religions, across languages would know what a janeu is. To call it a sacred thread, I thought was too limiting. And I have given a footnote in such places explaining to those who don't know janeu, perhaps people in the West, that it is the sacred thread. Perhaps I should add one point about the textual labor I had to undertake when I was setting out on the translation as well. It is lamentable, perhaps, that many regional language publications in India, and definitely that of Urdu and Farsi, do not get the best of editing at the time of publication. And this gives rise to many errors in original text. As I discovered during my long process of the translation of Chiragh-e-Dair, that even the original text had many errors in many places. And this has led to different problems even for translators. I've discovered Urdu translations of Chiragh-e-Dair which have problems because probably the original Farsi, that they were working with also had errors that they couldn't sometimes account for. So I'll give you an example even. I looked at many different editions of the original, therefore, and I sat with Persian scholars such as Professor Akhlaq Ahan and Mushtaq Ahmad Tijarvi Sahab of Jamia as well, to go over these different texts and to iron out these problems. So a more obvious error that cropped up was a mistake such as La Bayane was typed as Ala Bayane, which doesn't mean anything. But in other places, this creates more complex problems because other errors in different places created different possibilities of meaning. Belak was misprinted to Yelak, which can mean different things. In a more obvious error, which would be obvious to Urdu experts as well, was Daghe Chashm was printed as Daghe Jism. And a translator in Urdu, Hanif Naqvi Sahab, has unfortunately translated Daghe Jism in his translation, whereas the more authoritative version is probably Daghe Chashm, which is how I have translated this verse 33. And this is how most other Urdu translators have also translated verse 33. But Hanif Naqvi Sahab probably read from a text which had Daghe Jism, and he's translated that. To put forward perhaps a longer sequence of my translation, I'll read a section where Ghalib is largely praising the city of Benares, and ends with perhaps one of the most important verses from this collection, from this long poem, Chiragh-e-Dair, Temple Lamp in my translation. The eye boasts garden races, having seen Benares, whence the joy of the springtime of intimacy. Poetry attains its pride of place in heaven when it sings paeans in praise of Kashi. May God keep Benares from the evil eye. It is heavenly bliss, paradise established. Someone once compared the beauty of Benares to China, and since that day its brow is wrinkled with the bend of the Ganga. Delighted with its modes, the ways of being of Benares, with each breath, Delhi sends its blessings for Kashi. Were the eyes of Delhi's dreams transfigured as Benares? Is that why its mouth rules now with the waters of its canal? To call it the envy of Delhi would be discourtesy, but it should be no wonder that there is jealousy. I'll skip a few verses here and get to the core of what I meant to read out. And Ghalib is talking here about now souls and transfiguration. Behold the tamasha of these souls without bodies. Their spectacle bears no concern with water or dust. Their being is light like the fragrance of roses. They are pure life and soul. The body does not intervene. Even straw and thorn become the garden of paradise here, as it were. Its dust turns into the jewel of the soul, as it were. In this ancient temple city of magic, its spring is free from change of color. Be it in spring or in summer or winter, the weather here each season is that of heaven. Escaping the bleakest winters and scorching summers, spring pitches winter and summer camps in Kashi. Autumn, when it shakes its wings in pride, becomes on Kashi's forehead a proud sandalwood mark. Bowing in respect to the very air of this garden that is Benares, the spring breeze wears a janeu made of flowers. If it not be a tilak on the forehead of the sky, then pray tell what is that many-hued wave of twilight. Each fleck of dirt here in its ecstasy is a temple. Every thorn with its verdure becomes paradise. This settlement is the seat of the idol-worshipping faithful. From beginning to end, it is the pilgrimage of mystics, the supreme place of worship for the conch blowers. Surely Benares is the Kaaba of Hindustan.
Thank you very much, Maaz, for this most wonderful talk, discussion, and indeed for your absolutely brilliant translation. Allow me to say that though Ghalib's debt on posterity will always remain unpaid, by translating Chiragh-e-Dair into English, you have made a laudable effort to repay it in some measure. Thank you very much. Temple Lamp, published by Penguin Classics, is available in almost all bookshops and on Amazon. MyBook is a podcast about books and their authors. In our next show of the podcast, you will meet another author with another book. My Book podcast show is produced by Parvez Alam and Achla Sharma for Cine Ink, a hub of podcasts based in London. To listen to other episodes of My Book, you can visit the Cine Ink website www.cineinc.com. Cineink podcasts are also available on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, and YouTube. I'm Saif Mahmood, signing off for now. Goodbye.